Olivia is sitting in a small cafe near her office, stirring the same cup of coffee she ordered 20 minutes ago. Not because she wants more sugar, but because she doesn't feel ready to return to her desk. And she watches people through the window rushing past with laptops, bags, phone calls, expressions full of urgency. And she suddenly feels disconnected from all of it. Not in a dramatic way, just in a quiet, heavy sense of distance. Like she is present in the scene, but not emotionally included in it. And she realizes that lately this feeling follows her everywhere at work, at home, even with friends, as if her life continues normally while she stands slightly to the side of it, observing rather than participating. And she thinks about how a year ago she was excited about this job, about independence, about building something meaningful. And now most of her days consist of answering emails, attending meetings where nothing important is decided, smiling politely, and going home too tired to care about what she actually feels. And as she takes a small sip of the now lukewarm coffee, she remembers a moment from last weekend when her friend asked her a simple question: "Are you happy?" And she laughed automatically, said, "Yeah, of course," without thinking, and only later realized she had no idea if that was true. And this realization unsettles her, not because her life is bad, but because it is empty in a very functional way. Everything works, nothing collapses, yet something inside her feels slowly muted. And she wonders when she stopped paying attention to her own emotions, when she replaced curiosity with routine, when she accepted being tired as a personality trait. And sitting there in the cafe, surrounded by noise and movement, Olivia becomes aware that the biggest change in her life didn't happen through a breakup, a failure, or a crisis, but through gradual emotional withdrawal, day by day choosing efficiency over presence, safety over honesty, distraction over reflection. And for the first time, she admits to herself that she doesn't need a new job or a new city as much as she needs to reconnect with the version of herself that once cared, questioned, felt deeply, and believed that life was something to be lived, not simply managed. That evening, Olivia stands in the shower longer than usual, letting the warm water run over her shoulders while her mind drifts through the day, replaying small, insignificant moments that suddenly feel loaded with meaning. The way she nodded during meetings without listening, the way she smiled at colleagues without feeling connected, the way she kept checking her phone not because she was waiting for something, but because she was avoiding the silence inside her own head. And she realizes how exhausting this quiet avoidance has become, how much energy it takes to constantly stay distracted, constantly stay functional. And as she turns off the water and wraps herself in a towel, she feels a strange emptiness. Not loneliness exactly, but the absence of emotional presence, like she has been physically alive but mentally distant from her own experiences. And she sits on the edge of her bed, scrolling through old photos on her phone, pictures from years ago where she looks more expressive, more engaged, more emotionally open. And she wonders when she became so careful, so controlled, so resistant to feeling anything too deeply. And she recognizes that part of her learned to associate emotional intensity with instability, so she chose calm, predictability, and neutrality instead, believing that safety meant happiness. And now she understands that safety without meaning feels like a well-designed waiting room, comfortable but directionless. And as she closes the photo app and stares at the blank wall, Olivia feels a subtle but undeniable truth settling in. She hasn't lost herself through tragedy. She has simply stopped showing up emotionally, one quiet day at a time. And the hardest part is admitting that nothing external needs fixing first, because the distance she feels exists entirely inside her. The next day, Olivia meets her mother for lunch, sitting across from her at a small restaurant they visited countless times before, and she notices how familiar the conversation feels. The same topics, the same updates, the same polite laughter. And while everything seems normal on the surface, she feels an unexpected sense of detachment, like she is performing the role of daughter rather than actually being present as herself.
And as her mother talks about work, neighbors, distant relatives, Olivia nods, listens, responds automatically. But inside, she becomes aware of a subtle emotional distance, a quiet barrier she has built not only with others but with her own feelings. And she reflects on how long it has been since she had a conversation that wasn't structured, planned, or emotionally safe, one where she could say something uncertain, vulnerable, or unfinished. And this thought unsettles her because she realizes that even in her closest relationships, she has learned to maintain emotional neutrality, avoiding discomfort by staying agreeable, calm, and predictable. And as she stirs her food absent-mindedly, she notices a small ache in her chest, a longing for depth, for authenticity, for connection that feels real rather than functional. And she recognizes that her life has become efficient but emotionally thin, stable but internally quiet. And she wonders if she has confused emotional control with emotional maturity, and whether the cost of that control has been her own presence in the relationships that once defined her. And for the first time, sitting across from someone who knows her better than anyone else, Olivia feels the strange realization that she has never been more invisible to herself than in moments when everything appears perfectly normal. Later that night, Olivia lies on her couch with the TV playing quietly in the background, a show she has watched before and barely pays attention to. And she realizes how often she uses noise as a way to avoid listening to herself, how silence feels too revealing, too honest. And she reflects on how easily she fills every empty space with content, scrolling, podcasts, music, anything to keep her mind occupied. And she notices how rare it has become for her to sit with her own thoughts without distraction. And as she lowers the volume, the room feels suddenly heavier, not uncomfortable, just more real, and she becomes aware of a subtle sadness, not attached to any specific event, but to the general feeling that she has slowly drifted away from her own emotional center. And she thinks about all the moments she chose convenience over curiosity, stability over growth, politeness over honesty. And she realizes that none of these choices were wrong individually, but together they created a life that feels emotionally distant from herself. And as she stares at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of the city outside, Olivia understands that the biggest challenge ahead is not changing circumstances, but relearning how to tolerate emotional discomfort, how to sit with uncertainty, how to let herself feel without immediately trying to manage or explain it. And she recognizes that real presence is not always peaceful, not always pleasant, but always honest. And that perhaps the quiet unease she feels now is not a problem to fix, but a signal that she is finally paying attention again. The following weekend, Olivia agrees to meet an old friend she hasn't seen in years, someone who used to know her before life became structured, scheduled, and emotionally contained. And as they sit together on a bench in a small park, watching people walk their dogs and children play, she feels a strange mix of familiarity and distance, like reconnecting with a version of herself she barely remembers. And the conversation starts lightly, updates about work, relationships, cities they've lived in, but slowly shifts into something more personal, more reflective. And when her friend asks, almost casually, "Do you actually like the life you're living right now?" Olivia feels her body tense before her mind reacts, because the question lands deeper than she expected. And she notices her usual impulse to respond with something safe, something neutral, something polite. But instead, she pauses, feeling the discomfort rise, the uncertainty, the lack of a clear answer. And she realizes that for years she has avoided exactly this kind of moment, moments where she doesn't know what to say because she hasn't allowed herself to ask the question honestly. And as she looks around the park at people laughing, arguing, being fully engaged in their emotions, she feels a quiet awareness that her own emotional life has been on pause, carefully protected from risk, intensity, or vulnerability. And she finally admits out loud, softly, "I don't know if I like it, but I know I'm used to it." And hearing her own words feels unsettling and relieving at the same time, because for the first time in a long while, she is not performing a version of herself. She is simply present, uncertain, unfinished, and real. And as the conversation continues, Olivia understands that this honesty doesn't fix anything immediately. It doesn't change her job, her routine, or her relationships, but it creates a small crack in the emotional distance she has built, a space where curiosity can return, where questions are allowed, and where life can slowly shift from something she manages to something she actually experiences from the inside. That night, after returning home from the park, Olivia sits at her desk with her laptop open but untouched, the familiar glow of the screen reflecting on her face as she scrolls through job listings she doesn't really intend to apply for. Not because she's unhappy with her work in a dramatic sense, but because she is searching for the feeling of possibility, the idea that something could be different. And she realizes how often she has mistaken external change for internal movement, believing that a new role, a new city, or a new relationship would automatically reconnect her with herself. And as she closes the browser and leans back in her chair, she becomes aware that the real distance she feels has nothing to do with her circumstances, but with the way she has learned to emotionally regulate everything, smoothing out discomfort, suppressing curiosity, avoiding intensity. And she reflects on how even her dreams have become cautious, realistic, designed to avoid disappointment rather than pursue meaning. And this thought feels heavier than anything else, because it suggests that she has slowly trained herself not to want too much, not to expect too much, not to feel too much. And as the room falls into silence, Olivia senses a quiet shift happening. Not excitement, not fear, but awareness, the kind that changes how she sees her own patterns. And she understands that reconnecting with herself will not come from bold decisions or sudden transformations, but from the slow, uncomfortable practice of noticing her own desires again, allowing herself to want things without immediately minimizing them, and accepting that feeling alive may require risking uncertainty, instability, and emotional exposure, things she has spent years carefully avoiding. A few days later, Olivia finds herself standing in line at the grocery store, holding a basket of the same familiar items she buys every week, and she suddenly becomes aware of how predictable her choices have become, not only in food, but in almost every aspect of her life. The same meals, the same routes, the same conversations, the same emotional responses. And she realizes that routine has given her comfort, but also quietly narrowed her world, reducing her experiences to what feels safe, efficient, and emotionally neutral. And as she watches the cashier scan items with mechanical speed, she reflects on how much of her own life feels similarly automated, like she's constantly optimizing instead of experiencing. And she notices a small impulse rise within her, the desire to choose something unfamiliar, something unnecessary, something that doesn't serve a practical purpose. And she adds a random book from a nearby shelf to her basket, not because she knows she will like it, but because the act itself feels symbolic, a small disruption to her carefully controlled patterns. And walking out of the store, she feels a subtle sense of agency, not dramatic, but real, the awareness that even minor choices can represent a shift toward presence, toward curiosity, toward participation in her own life. And she understands that change does not begin with large declarations or radical moves, but with these small intentional moments where she chooses engagement over autopilot, uncertainty over predictability, and experience over efficiency. That evening, Olivia sits on her balcony with the new book resting unopened on her lap, the city lights flickering softly around her, and she realizes that the most significant changes in her life are not visible from the outside. No one at work knows, her friends haven't noticed, her routine looks exactly the same, yet internally, something has shifted. Not dramatically, but perceptibly, like a quiet recalibration of attention. And she reflects on how long she lived believing that emotional stability meant emotional absence, that calm meant control, and that being fine was the same as being alive. And now she understands that calm without depth is just another form of distance. And as she finally opens the book and reads the first few lines, she notices how difficult it feels to focus, how easily her mind wants to wander back to tasks, messages, plans. And she sees clearly how trained she has become to avoid stillness, to avoid presence. And she allows herself to stay anyway, to read slowly, to pause, to feel boredom, curiosity, impatience, all without trying to escape them. And in this simple act, she senses a subtle but powerful truth. She is learning how to stay with herself again, not as a problem to fix, not as a project to improve, but as a living experience unfolding moment by moment. And for the first time in a long while, she feels not happier, not transformed, but present, which feels rarer, more honest, and more valuable than any external success she has achieved so far. One morning, a few weeks later, Olivia wakes up before her alarm and lies in bed listening to the quiet sounds of her apartment, the distant traffic, the hum of the city slowly starting its day, and she notices that for the first time in a long while, her mind is not immediately rushing toward obligations, schedules, or plans, but resting in a simple awareness of being here. And she reflects on how subtle the change has been. No dramatic decisions, no sudden breakthroughs, just a gradual return to herself through small moments of attention, honesty, and presence. And she realizes that nothing in her external life has drastically changed. She still works at the same job, lives in the same place, meets the same people. But internally, her relationship with experience feels different, less guarded, less controlled, more open to uncertainty. And as she gets out of bed and walks to the window, watching the soft morning light touch the buildings across the street, she feels a quiet gratitude, not for achievements or outcomes, but for the simple fact that she is no longer absent from her own life. And she understands that the version of herself who lived on autopilot was not wrong or broken, just disconnected, trying to stay safe by staying emotionally distant. And now she sees that safety without presence is just another kind of isolation, and that living fully does not mean constant excitement or happiness, but the willingness to experience whatever arises, boredom, curiosity, discomfort, joy, without immediately escaping it. And standing there in the early light, Olivia makes no promises about the future, no grand resolutions, only a quiet commitment to remain attentive, to keep showing up emotionally, even when it feels uncomfortable or uncertain, because for the first time, she understands that life does not begin after everything is figured out. It begins in the moment she chooses to actually be inside it.